So, terrorism is essentially a tactic, a violent tactic as employed to pursue certain objectives. Often, terrorism results in the deaths of innocent people. Some would argue that terrorism is legitimate and justifiable in a situation where people are being oppressed and all peaceful and democratic methods have been exhausted. Others would say terror can never be justified, and non-violent protest and resistance to oppression is the only moral way. There's always a better way than terrorism. Terrorism exacerbates problems, it doesn't solve them. It creates a cycle of violence and suffering. But do we have to admit that terrorism has been successful in getting results? I mean, oftentimes peaceful protests simply fail, while we have to admit that certain terrorist groups have succeeded in bringing governments to the negotiating table and have won concessions from them. However, one might argue that in the long term, terrorism has far less chance of succeeding than does other peaceful means. And this is because terror angers and polarizes. It antagonizes people. And people don't tend to forget those who have violently targeted them. Surely, if you're looking to win freedom, peace, dignity for your people, you can see that in the long run you won't be able to have or maintain the things you value by bombing or shooting your enemies. Lasting settlements are won when parties to a conflict or disagreement freely give consent to the settlement or agreement as equals. And people, groups, they have to be able to trust each other for settlements to last in the long run. Is it true to say that terrorism can raise the profile of a neglected cause? The hijackings in the 70s and 80s most definitely brought the Palestinian cause to the world's attention. We've seen it before. Terror groups, people who call themselves freedom fighters, they want the attention of governments, media, maybe citizens of a certain country, or they just want everyone's attention. But the thing is, the kind of terror that attracts the widest audience is the most violent kind. And the most violent kind, for the most part, is met with reactions of outrage and disgust. People don't tend to sympathize with those whose actions disgust them. You sometimes hear terrorists talk about legitimate targets. Like you'll hear tyrants, people guilty of state terrorism, labeling their enemies as terrorists and saying anyone who helps them might as well be a terrorist. So they say their enemies are legitimate targets. And the people fighting against repressive regimes will say, perhaps, all soldiers are legitimate targets as agents of the regime that's oppressing them. Then maybe later they will say, anyone who aids the repressive regime is a legitimate target. Then anyone who doesn't actively oppose the regime is a legitimate target. And while both sides and with both sides, willing to use force against the other, with both sides widening their definition of legitimate targets, you have to ask, where does this lead? Spiraling violence and maybe eventual all-out war. That's where it leads. The thing is, most people, they want to live peaceful lives, free from violence and conflict. And this is true despite what violent governments who employ state terrorism might say. It's true despite what extremist groups who falsely claim to be fighting for the liberation of the people might say. We've seen it before. Terrorism creates environments where poverty, fear, and anxiety will perpetuate. People can't feel safe in their daily actions if they are afraid of being targeted. Terrorism can lead to a lowering of the quality of life in a given area. And in the world we live in today, with our globalized economy, you have to think governments and businesses are less likely to want to engage or set up in a location that is seen as violent and unstable. And so areas that are rife with terrorist activity are likely to remain poor and comparatively underdeveloped. And what about states or institutions created in concession to terror. Is it not true to say that such states or institutions are often corrupt and dominated by violent criminals? Violent criminals get into power, and often what you will see is this. Nothing will be done to improve the lives of the people in whose name terror has been used. They will appoint other violent types to positions of power, and they will pursue minority interests at the expense of the community at large. They will persecute and they will silence dissidents. The fruits of terror, so to speak. Anyway, some food for thought there, I would hope. Take it easy, folks, and I will see you next video.